Hi everyone, this presentation is about reviewing the literature. So one of the curious things about research is that every published study will contain some sort of review of the literature. And yet there's very little guidance out there about how to go about reviewing the literature. And so this presentation I'm offering to you as a form of some guidance on how to go about reviewing the literature. So this will be helpful for your article analysis assignment, but also in future when you go on to actual research. So the first thing that I would like to stress is the distinction between reviewing the literature and the literature review. So what I mean by this is that reviewing the literature is really a two-step process. The first step is around reviewing the literature, that is critically evaluating research and evidence that's already out there about your topic or area of interest. So that's reviewing the literature. And a slightly different task, a separate task, I would say, is writing the literature review. So pretty much every journal article, every published study, every thesis will have some form of literature review in it, even if it hasn't got that title, right? Even if it's not specifically called a literature review, there will be more than likely some form of literature review. Those two things, I think it's really helpful to think about them as distinct elements of reviewing the literature. So whereas the first one, reviewing the literature, is what you need to do now, particularly for these reasons here, right? Informing yourself of what is going on in the field, getting a level of topical and methodological knowledge and expertise, finding gaps in the literature, critically evaluating methods used in researching what you're interested in researching, and using that to think about your own methodological approach. Right? These are all the kinds of things that you need to be doing now. What you don't need to be doing yet is actually writing a literature review, which is more about the process of establishing your authority as some sort of having some kind of expertise and knowledge about the field in which you are conducting your research. So for the purposes of this presentation, we are going to be focusing on the process of reviewing the literature. So I'm going to give you some advice on how to go about reviewing the literature. Now, there are, very broadly speaking, two kinds of literature review. So we've got the traditional or the narrative literature review, and we've got the systematic review. This is a very crude distinction, but it's one that it's important to make. So the traditional or the narrative review is the kind of review which most EdD students do, most qualitative researchers do, and which you will find in most published studies. And as the name suggests, you kind of tell the story of what the evidence around your topic currently says. And we're going to be focusing on that traditional or narrative type review in this presentation, in this session. We're going to be focused on this one. The other kind of review is called a systematic review, and that is a kind of research project methodology in its own right. So a systematic review is where you systematically search for and review all of the available evidence on a given topic, and it's particularly useful for establishing things like what's best practice in a given area. So systematic reviews actually originated in medicine as a way of finding out, what seems to be, the best practice in medicine. What's the best way to treat this disease or this illness, or what's the best kind of therapy for that condition? You get some of this kind of research in teaching, right? So what's the best way to go about teaching X and Y and Z? But it's not used nearly as often as a traditional or narrative review in the kind of research that you're going to be doing. So by all means, go and find out more about systematic reviews. But for the purposes of today, we are going to be focused on the narrative or traditional literature review. So I just need to change my pointer back to the mouse so I can switch slides. And here we go. So we're just going to talk briefly about the kind of research which you might incorporate into your reviewing of the literature. You might want to be a bit creative, you might want to be a bit inventive, and if you're going to get a picture of the various kinds of research which are done that relate to whatever it is you're interested in, there are different kinds of producers that you might want to look into. So firstly, and perhaps most obviously, we've got scholars, right? So whether that is academics or other PhD, other doctoral students, master's students, but we've got scholars to begin with. Various types of associations, whether those are sort of professional associations or interest groups or research associations, so other collections of interested parties. So you could look at associations, businesses, particularly bigger businesses, corporations often conduct research. So you could look at for those kinds of reports. Learned institutions. So by that, I mean things like the Royal Society, for instance, or Royal Societies and other such organizations. Professional organizations, so teaching organizations, for instance, and related to that, teaching unions, you can see at the bottom of the list, also conduct research. Pressure groups and charities, so where research has a political dimension particularly, or perhaps a socio-economic or cultural dimension, pressure groups and charities might well be involved. And the government also produce reports, statistics, and so on, as well as legislation. So all of these producers could be potential sources of research for you to review. And from those various kinds of producers, we might get various kinds of sources. So again, although the library and the databases within OneSearch and the internet might be your first ports of call, there are other possibilities. So here are some of the other sorts of sources which you might choose to include in your reviewing of the literature. So we've got books, we've got journal articles, we've got conference papers, also sometimes called conference proceedings, which are often written up and catalogued, particularly for the bigger conferences. And we've got policy documents, whether those are from central government, local government, or individual institutions, legislation, newspapers, and blogs and so on, online sources. You perhaps don't always want to necessarily include those as part of your formal literature review, but they can give you leads, if you like, or ideas, things to chase up on. So, science reporting often appears in the broadsheet newspapers. or reports about pedagogical research might appear in something like the Times educational supplement. I would encourage you actually to go to the source though and read for yourself the research that's being reported on in the newspapers, rather than relying on the newspaper report itself, if you can. Science reporting, for instance, is often quite poor in quality, as a book like Ben Goldacre's Bad Science has very eloquently and convincingly pointed out. Okay, I would really encourage you, even if you are at an early stage in your studies, to look at other theses and dissertations. You know, doctoral students are at the cutting edge of research. You know, they are doing new and exciting and inventive and original work. And so they really have their finger on the pulse. Looking at current or recent theses can help you find more current literature, as well as informing you about whatever has been written in that thesis. And there are collections of these. So Hope Library has hardbound copies of every doctoral thesis that's been produced here. And there are also online repositories of electronic theses as well. So a big one that I'm familiar with, for instance, is called the White Rose e-theses repository, which collects all of the doctoral theses and makes available all of the doctoral theses from universities in Yorkshire, right? Hence White Rose. So, you know, Leeds, Sheffield, and so on. You've got reviews and reports, right? Again, from governments, businesses, charities, pressure groups, and so on. So they're another potential form of literature, as are published statistics, whether these come from governments or other sources. So in reviewing the literature, you probably want to draw on some combination of these kinds of sources, because you are want to establish as broad and well-informed a picture as you can of whatever topic it is that you're interested in. And that brings us to think about the purpose of reviewing the literature. Now, the purpose of reviewing a literature is often described in terms of locating your work within the field. So in other words, you need to show that you have expertise in, and perhaps, you know, given that you're working towards a doctorate, command of your subject. So you need to show that you have extensive knowledge of your subject. You need to show that your research does not just exist in a vacuum, but that it exists in relation to work that other people have already done. And Jerry Wellington summarized this up very neatly. Your job is not just to mold your own brick, but to slot it into the wall of existing understanding in that field. And your job of reviewing the literature at this stage is about developing your understanding of that wall, and so that at some point in the future you can mold your own brick to fit that wall. So you're wanting to show ultimately that you are familiar with key works and writers, that you can perhaps trace ideas to their origins, that you can use literature to help you conceptualize a study and refine your research questions. And reviewing the literature can also help you focus the topic of your study, begin to synthesize the relevant ideas and concepts, and perhaps even begin to hypothesize about what it is you're going to investigate. And you can perhaps think about two categories of literature that can form part of your review. So on the one hand, theoretical literature, and on the other, empirical literature. So in referring to theoretical literature, we mean literature which explores the theories, the concepts, the ideas, epistemologies, ontologies, in short, the positionalities that have been used to investigate your topic or your issue to date. And then in contrast to that, we have empirical literature, in other words, research evidence that's come from analysis and findings from existing studies. So reviewing empirical literature will help you assess that existing evidence to your topic, or relevant to your topic. So this process of reviewing the literature can help you to identify the key theoretical and philosophical positions that have been used to explore your topic, to develop an appreciation of the major issues and debates around your topic, the political standpoints that are in play, the origins and definitions of key theories, concepts, and ideas that have been used to explore your topic, and to get a sense of the main questions and problems that have been addressed to date in relation to your topic. Now, if you do a thorough review of the literature, more than likely you will identify gaps in that literature, i.e. work that needs to be done but hasn't been done yet, tensions and inconsistencies between different viewpoints, different findings, different sets of evidence, different theoretical and philosophical positions. You will find all of those things, almost certainly, if you do your reviewing thoroughly. But those things are gold dust for you, right? Gaps, tensions, inconsistencies, those are gold dust for you, because those are the things that could help you focus and articulate more precisely your research question and topic. Most people don't want to just replicate work that has gone on before. That does happen, particularly in the hard sciences. But in the kind of research that you're going to do for an education doctorate, replication studies are pretty rare. So you don't just want to repeat what has already been done before by someone else. You want to do something original. And knowing where the gaps, tensions, and inconsistencies are can help you work out what is likely to be original, what is likely to make a contribution to knowledge that has not been made yet. Okay, so we've talked about why you review the literature, and it's about, in summary, developing a high level of knowledge and understanding of your topic and your field. We're now going to move to talk a little bit about the practicalities of how you go about doing your reviewing of the literature. So the first thing is get organized, right? So we've talked about, we've defined research already as systematic, methodical, rigorous inquiry. And so every aspect of your research needs to be systematic, methodical, rigorous. So that includes the way that you work with literature. And I've summarized this with the headings search, screen, select, and save. So be systematic in your searching, right? Be rigorous and iterative, vary search terms, look again and again and again, right? Don't just go in one hit and expect to get all the answers, but research, right? Search again and again and again to keep up to date with what's going on in your field. And plan out, right, the search terms, the combinations of search terms you're going to use, the places you're going to use them, and so on, right? So be systematic and keep track of the searches that you do so that you don't repeat yourself or forget what you've done. Be strategic, right? So think about which databases and which sources are likely to be most relevant to you and focus your energies on those. Be inventive, be flexible, think about how you might use different search terms that relate to what you're interested in to find more results. use wildcards. In other words, things like stars at the end of words will help you produce more results. So for instance, if you put an asterisk at the end of learn, you'll get things to do with learning, learner, learned, and so on. Be organized. So keep track of what you search and what you find. So some people do this, for instance, using referencing software. Something like Mendeley is a common one. Others are available. Some people will just keep an Excel spreadsheet. Some people would organize the material they find into folders. Find a way that works for you, but be organized and keep track as you go along, particularly of the citation details, like the Harvard referencing information, because it becomes very time consuming if you have to go back to something that you first found some months earlier in order to check what the referencing information is. You can spend hours doing that if you're not careful. So keep track as you go along. And finally, and you will have said this, I'm sure, to your own students at some point, but be active, right? Don't just hope that you can sponge in everything that you read by magic or osmosis. You can't, right? Actively engage with the material. So when you read something, write something. That might be just a few bullet points to summarize the key points of the article and perhaps your initial reflections on it. It might be more detailed notes and annotations. Again, you find what works for you, but be active, read something, write something, or even draw something, but do something with each text if it seems relevant. Okay, now, one of the characteristics of a narrative literature review is a critical evaluation of that literature. So in other words, you are not just reporting on other people's findings. You know, Smith and Jones found this, and then X and Y found the other, and then somebody else found something different, right? You're not just reporting like that. You have got to critically evaluate the evidence or the theory which you are reviewing. So by being critical in this kind of scholarship, we mean a particular set of characteristics. It doesn't mean just ripping things apart. It means being critical in a different way. It does mean adopting an attitude of skepticism, right, or reasonable doubt. So we set out wanting or waiting to be convinced, right? We don't accept anything as a given. So we adopt an attitude of skepticism, and we habitually question the quality of other people's claims to knowledge. So on what basis are people saying that something is true or saying something is so, and does that really stand up? So we remain skeptical. We habitually question what we're being told and what we write and think ourselves. And yet, and this is what I mean about not just ripping things apart, we respect the work of others. So we don't, for instance, go in for ad hominem attacks, right? Attacks on the person, but we critically evaluate the work. And we also try to be open-minded. So we might be doubtful, we might be skeptical, but we're prepared to shift our position. We're prepared to change our minds if the case is convincing enough. So if careful scrutiny of what we're presented with changes our minds or shifts our point of view a bit, then we're prepared to move. We're not just seeking to entrench our existing position, our existing beliefs, but we're open to being persuaded if the scrutiny bears it out. And ultimately, we want to be constructive, right? So we might want to challenge others' works because that can help us find better ways of doing things or thinking about things. But just ripping other people's work apart to show that we're smarter than them, that's, or know more than them, that's not really acceptable. So we want to be constructive as well as open-minded. How do we go about that? So what does that look like in practice? Well, on the slide are some things which you can use as aspects of your critique of any piece of published research. So you might want to evaluate how well the problem or research questions are well defined and articulated. You might want to reflect on the positionality that's used, and might another perspective on the problem be more helpful. You might want to think about how well the theoretical framework, the sets of theories and concepts are deployed. Are they explained well and used consistently, for example? You might want to review their review of the literature. Is that sufficiently critical, and is it fair? You might want to reflect on the design of the study, and we'll come on to more of that in a moment on the next slide. You might want to evaluate the central argument that runs through the study, through the paper. How strong is that? Does it really stand up? Is it persuasive? You might want to think about how well the paper is written. You might want to offer some observations on what it contributes to our understanding, because every study should contribute something. And you might want to reflect on how does it relate to your own research. Right? Does it help you understand something? Might it help you to do something which leads to doing something better? Okay, so those are things which you could think about, critically evaluate, and some specifics to do with methodology and design here. Right, so being critical about design and methodology. So to think about the design itself, what are the strengths and weaknesses and ethical considerations given due weight? So is there sufficient knowledge and understanding shown of the strengths and weaknesses of the design and the associated ethical issues? Has an appropriate sample been used? So whether that's in terms of size or demographics or selection, right? Is the sample of people or data or text used in the study appropriate and sufficient for addressing the question? The data, is the volume, quantity, type, quality of data sufficient to justify the claims that are made subsequently? And are the methods of analysis clear enough, appropriate to the question and methodology, and are they rigorous enough? Now, I will add a bit of a caveat here, and it covers both of these last two slides, actually, the general and the methodology. If something has been published in a peer-reviewed journal, or if something has been published, in a textbook, it has gone through a rigorous peer review process, right? So in other words, other experts in the field have had to be convinced that there is some worth in the article or in the research. So you probably don't want to be overly critical, right, about the research that you're reviewing, because the fact that it's being published in an outlet like that suggests that the quality is probably pretty high, right? It's very hard to get things published. It's very competitive. Reviewers can be really quite nasty. And so, getting studies published is hard. So the fact that something has been published suggests that it does have some merit. So don't be overly keen, to slag things off, but do still maintain your attitude of skepticism, right? Of being needing still to be convinced, yet remaining open-minded and constructive about whatever it is you're reviewing. Okay, so that is the end of the presentation. So that's all my advice on the process of reviewing the literature. There are some references here which you could follow up on if you wish, if you want to know more about this, and I hope you do. But that's all for now. Thank you. Goodbye.